James, we had a reader write in with a question. He wants to know, what do you think is the worst thing among all the wrongs in our current society, the one thing that underpins everything else, the sort of root of all evil that's causing this decay or decline in our society?
The one problem that causes all the other problems. If we could
Yeah.
just get rid of this one thing, then everything else would be kind of fixed. That's a really great question. It's also a really hard question because there's so many problems, and it's hard to say there's just this one thing. And but I've actually thought about it a lot. I think about this stuff all the time, and I was actually having this conversation with my wife the other day. Believe it or not, this is sort of stuff we talk about in my house, and I used to think that the problem it was all in the government, and it's just terrible people in the government. And if we all these people, you got the I'm just going to use this guy as an example, the Chuck Schumers of the world, these people that have been in government forever, Nancy Pelosi, people that, and there's people on the right and the left that have been in this position. These people have been I'm 46 years old. There are people that have been in Congress since before I was born. And these people, it's like they're always railing about these problems in America. And it's like, you're part of you've been there for decades and decades. I mean, Joe Biden used to claim that he had all this experience, and, the guy with 5 decades of experience couldn't get anything right. And so I used to think that I would say, if there's one thing, if I could just sort of snap my finger, I would say it was term limits. If we could just have term limits and sort of force turnover, in the politicians, create, a different system where you had people. This is, you and I talked about this. This is actually bizarrely one of the things that the Federal Reserve gets right. And I don't remember off the top of my head, but term limits for, senior officials at the Fed. These are appointed officials, and these guys have term limits to go, 8, 10, 12 years, 14 years, something like that. It's a really long time. And, just versus in Congress, you have people that they got to go and run for reelection every 2 years. You don't have, when they passed the One Big Beautiful Bill, the President of the United States tweeted something out and said, well, I'm a fiscal conservative too, but you have to think about elections. You got to get reelected. And, that in many respects kind of proves the point that if you take that away and suddenly you don't have to worry about reelection anymore, you can just focus on doing the right thing over a long-term cycle. If you're somebody who gets appointed to, 10, 12, 14-year term, you have an entire, potentially multiple business cycles. And you can afford to think very long-term because, there's sure, you can be removed if you're an idiot, you can be impeached, all these sorts of things. But you don't have to worry about, oh my God, I got to go raise money for my reelection. You don't have to worry about that anymore. And you can just afford to do the things that you think this is what's in the best interest, long-term, not short-term, but long-term interest of the country. That it's the same thing in business, is that in a business is only going to work if everybody's aligned. You have to have the shareholders, the employees, the board of directors, senior executives, and management all have to be on the same page. And the incentives in, well-run, well-organized companies reflect that. They have options pools and packages and things that, people are issued out of the money options and so forth, that this option only becomes valuable if you generate enough growth in the business to make that option valuable. And then you become wealthier as a result of driving, wealth and success and value for your shareholders, and everybody's aligned and on the same page. And right now there's a massive misalignment in incentives and priorities between politicians and the political class and the constituents. There's a huge misalignment because we as voters, constituents, citizens are better off if we have people that are thinking long term, but the political incentives are to think very, very short term. And that's, I think, one of the issues. But then I realized that over time, I said, well, if we have term limits, then we get away from that. If we change the way, then it would require constitutional reform, which is really hard. But if you're able to have that, and you set different terms, everything where you don't have to constantly have re-elections and changes in government, you maybe create systems where it's easier to impeach corrupt officials, incompetent officials, et cetera. Maybe that would work. But then I stepped back. I said, well, no, actually, I'm wrong. That's not the problem. The problem is actually when your preamble starts with we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, and so on and so forth. When it starts with we the people, in a representative democracy, a Republican democracy, the problem in governance ultimately comes back to we the people. And it is, frankly, the voters who are, in many respects, ignorant, that continue to elect some of the most mind-numbingly stupid, unqualified, incompetent people to represent them. And we all see this, where you watch some of these videos, and whether it's somebody like AOC opening her mouth, or there's a lot of people on the right who, they talk, and you're just like, oh my God, this guy is just a sleazy used car salesman in a suit. I don't trust this guy as far as I can throw them. There was one guy, I watched this old video. It was from some years ago, and there was some military general or admiral who was testifying in front of Congress, and they were talking there. One of the congressmen was asking him about Guam, and I think he was from California, some Democrat from California. He was asking about Guam, and they were talking about all this buildup, and they're doing military construction, housing, adding to the bases. Do you remember this video?
I
remember.
And the
congressman
this.
asked him, he said, "Are you concerned that the island is going to tip over?"
He's like, yeah, with all the military equipment that
with
you
all
put
that
on
stuff,
one side
you
of the
put
island.
Right. You got all this military stuff on one side of the island. You're building all these bases and buildings and everything like that. And it's going to get lopsided, and the island's going to tip over.
The general just has to sit there
and
with
the guy had
this
straight face.
He goes, we don't anticipate that happening.
Geez, sir, we're gonna look into that, Congressman. Thanks for bringing that to our attention. And you just go, oh my God, how is this possible? But there were literally the average, when you think about it, is 435 members of Congress. Divide that into the population of the United States. It's like 700,000 people on average per congressional district. 750,000 people per congressional district. So, which means that like potentially hundreds of thousands of people were dumb enough to elect that guy, who doesn't understand that if you like pile up a bunch of stuff, that an island is not going to tip over.
He thinks islands float. He just has no basic understanding.
It's like a paper plate floating in the bathtub. And if you put, this is what I do with my kids, that you put too much stuff on one side, it might tip over. It's like, man, like my 2-year-old has figured that out. And this guy's a member of the United States Congress. And you just see, it's not an isolated example. It's one of the more hilarious ones, but it's not an isolated example. And so you think about it and go, well, my idea of saying, well, we should have term limits. And if we have term limits, but okay, then that guy has a term limit. So now that guy, do we really want that guy in there for 10 years? Somebody like Nancy Pelosi, who, as we talked about recently, who closed her thumb and her index finger and said that their multi-trillion dollar spending initiative, costs zero. And now you had Lindsey Graham, doing the same thing. Zeus, the budget king, the numbers king, pretending that math is just completely relative and you can just make it up and all these things. I do think there is something to be said for, and I come out of the military, and the military has a system of up or out. You either get promoted or you're gone. And that's it. If you get passed over and then passed over again, you're out. And the thing is, like, generals understand this. The last time there was a kind of from my cold dead hands do I give up this command kind of general was MacArthur. And that was a long time ago. These guys understand this now. I remember hearing about this when I was still at the academy. And the guy who was his name was Dan Chrisman. He was lieutenant general at the time, and I remember he was talking to us, and he was talking about how he was going to retire, even though he loved being the superintendent of the U.S. Military Academy. And he's saying, if I stay in my position, I'm clogging the system. It means that younger guys, the next generation of bright leaders, they're not going to be able to come up and infuse their ideas and their energy into the Army, and that's going to be my fault. So I'm out of here. I have to retire. I owe it to the Army and my country to retire. Wow. When was the last time a politician ever said that? Never.
Actually, related,
Never.
Do you think there should be age limits on these politicians? These people that are in their 80s, and one of them, Dianne Feinstein, was
who's a corpse
by the time
who's a corpse. Yeah. When Joe Biden, turned and shook hands with thin air, and I think everybody said, wow. But the reality is, I know people, it's funny. And maybe we have another conversation about why that is. But this people, I mean, I was actually just reading, a number of articles about this, about people in their 40s and 50s getting diagnosed with early onset dementia. Who's the guy from Pennsylvania?
Fetterman had
Fetterman,
a
right?
stroke. Yeah,
Exactly. I mean, had a stroke and had a lot of issues. I mean, he's not 80, so I mean, it is maybe there should be maybe there should actually be some level of competency
cognitive test.
as opposed to we'll come back to that as opposed to like age, because frankly, like there's people that I know. I mean, Warren Buffett at age 80
Right.
was like Tom Brady at age 40. You know what I mean? I mean, Gronkowski used to talk about, he's like, Tom Brady throwing footballs at age 40 is, he has lost zero heat on that ball from age 30 to age 40. And I would know. And this is a guy who's, Hall of Fame, tight end, future Hall of Fame tight end, saying this. Warren Buffett in his 80s was sharp as a tack. I mean, even in his 90s, obviously like lost a massive step. And for this, he's stepping down. But I mean, I don't know that age. I mean, I know plenty of people in their 80s that have super high energy. I would say Donald Trump is super high energy. I mean, that guy is really, really high energy. So I don't know that it's necessarily age, but the point is, like, I think you should have to demonstrate that you know something. And this goes back to what I think really is the issue, is the concept of, and I'll just say it, universal suffrage is considered by many to be the crowning achievement of American democracy. And what that ultimately means is that anybody and everybody can go and vote. And I just kind of feel like you think about all the things that you have to do to get a license in the United States. You have to have a license to be a cosmetologist, to be a hair braider, to be a landscape architect, to be a tree trimmer, to drive a vehicle, to all these things that you have to do, right? I mean, when was the last time you heard of like some mass death event from a cosmetologist, a major cosmetologist incident? I mean, it doesn't happen. And yet picking the wrong people, even at state level, local level, certainly federal level, where you pick the wrong person that ends up chairing the Senate Budget Committee or the House Ways and Means Committee, or somebody that's just a complete moron who's making national security decisions that doesn't know that an island's not going to tip over into the ocean, right? So maybe that guy needs to demonstrate that he or she knows a thing or two, but maybe the voters actually need to demonstrate that they know a thing or two. Maybe a voter should have to know something about the federal budget, about the deficit, about the national debt, about the way that government even works, about appropriations, about the way that legislation is passed.
Pass the citizenship test, maybe starting.
It's funny. My wife did that, and it was the dumbest thing ever. I mean, it was this opportunity that the federal government has to show that, like, not only are you part of this culture that you actually understand, but you have more than just a rote memory. I mean, it was just a quiz. It was just memorize this thing. Who was the first Supreme Court justice? Who was all these like little things. It's like, none of this makes you a better citizen. None of this imbues you with any kind of desire to be able to think creatively or critically about a particular problem and say, what is this problem? What is the information that I need to even understand this problem? What's the information that I need to understand what the possible solutions might be? More importantly, what's the information that I need to be able to determine whether or not somebody who's presenting a solution even knows what he or she is talking about, right? Because we see this stuff every day. And whatever it is that you do in your life, when somebody's full of it. When somebody's coming at you and saying, oh, yeah, whatever. And like, that dude's completely full of crap. And it's the same, it should be the same with politicians when they come and they say, as you and I were talking about the other day, one of the most popular phrases in politics right now? People will die. People will die. Whatever it is that they oppose, there's some line in this bill, in the one big beautiful bill, they're cutting this little spending over here. And so Chuck Schumer goes to the floor and says, people are going to die. There will be people who die as a result of this.
Children will go hungry.
Children will go hungry. People will die, all this sort of stuff. And so, voters should be able to demonstrate that they can tell what's real from what's not, what's true from what's not. And at this point, there's no excuse anymore, because we can go, Grok, Is what he's saying true? And, Grok will give you a pretty good, truth seeking answer, because that's what Grok was designed to do. And for there to be so many of these free resources to help people understand what the truth is and to understand what might be complex topics and break those down into, simpler terms and simpler. It's like not anybody has to have a PhD in economics, but you should probably at least have a grasp of, okay, what are the implications of having a $36 trillion national debt today and passing a bill that carries a $3 trillion, $3+ trillion deficit increase. They'll have a $3 trillion deficit just this year alone, and $3 trillion in additional deficits on top of the $22 trillion in deficit spending over the next 10 years that the Congressional Budget Office is already projecting. And what are the implications of that?
I mean,
people
we
should probably have to understand that, right?
The voters should start by like putting how many zeros are after a trillion, and I bet that would knock out a good percentage of them right there. But
you're probably right about that, but I feel like it's not a question of cognitive ability. We don't need people to do calculus, right? We don't need people to do we're not asking people to reinvent the wheel or design LLMs and AI systems and high performance semiconductors or any of these things. What we are asking people to do is be able to understand what's true from what's not true. What is it when this politician's telling me something that's completely and totally bogus? And I should be able to tell the difference. And I should be able to think critically and truthfully and understand long-term implications. I think people should, I think politicians should at least have to do that. And I don't think it's a bad idea for voters to be able to do that. But otherwise we just go, oh, you're 18. Here you go. Go out and vote. Or you can be 90 and, not be one of these people that does have super hardcore dementia and you don't even know how your voting card works. If you're not sharp enough to be able to like register to vote, maybe you shouldn't be able to vote. I mean, there got to be, to me, like there needs to be certain qualifications to that.
Well, now there's a lot of politicians that want to drop the voting age. They say that it should be 16 or it should be,
yeah, I mean, sure. My son's too. Like he should be able to vote too. Why not? Let the 2-year-olds vote. I mean, it's like it's ludicrous. And of course, if you dare say, well, maybe everybody shouldn't necessarily just automatically have the right to vote, then you're called every name in the book. And it's not about class. It's not about wealth level, income level, ideology. It doesn't matter to me whether people are on the left or the right or the center or the far this or far that. You should at least, some people are going to be incredibly passionate about their thing, whether it's the environment or whether it's about, some kind of social justice or whatever. But you should at least be able to demonstrate that you understand facts and how to find facts and how to understand the truth. You should be able to demonstrate that you have the ability to sort of reason and look at long-term consequences, before you're given the authority to pick the guy who has his hand on the nuclear codes, and to just sort of give that away to anybody. Go, oh, you turn 18, here you go. Choose the guy who has the nuclear launch codes, who gets to indebt future generations, and all this stuff is shoved into a system where there's a complete disconnect between the ultra short term, every 2-year political incentives versus the long term natural incentives that any human being has. Our incentives should be long term because, the average person lives for decades and decades and decades. So we have to think long term. But politicians' incentives is think very, very short term. So to put all that stuff together, it's just broken. It's completely broken.
If they did make some sort of test, when you were saying this, it made me think of like fact checkers or these like
I don't mean it like that.
Malinformation. Like if the wrong people designed this test, it would be like, do you think vaccines cause autism or something like that?
That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about like because that stuff is inherently incredibly biased, and in some respect, everything we can think of is biased. It's sort of like, is the glass half full or half empty? There's so many ways you could look at that glass and describe it, and the way that that's described betrays some level of bias. Everything is bias. It's hard to say like something is like 100% truthful, but it's really just it's an ability to demonstrate reason. And we've been talking about this. I mean, you and I have been writing about this for years. The concept of the inspired idiot, the passionate ignoramus, is the people that, I mean, there's so many examples of this. A lot of, some of them on the right, a lot of them on the left. We like to poke fun of the ones on the left because they're the most hilarious. Queers for Palestine. That's, I mean, it's like, it's all those sorts of things. These people, screaming and yelling about this stuff that just,
From the river to the sea.
From the river to the sea. They have no idea which river or which sea. Or you see these videos where these guys that are out there and they're waving their Palestinian flags, and you get some of these TikTokers or whatever, they go up to them and they said, "Hey, what are you doing here?" And they go, I don't actually know. I just wanted to be here. I'm convinced that a lot of times when they have these like huge, marches and protests, whatever, I mean, a lot of people are there not because they actually know or they care, or they have any idea what's going on. It just, especially if you're young, that looks like a cool thing to do,
Well, the Black Lives Matters ones were during COVID. You weren't allowed to leave your house unless you were protesting for Black Lives Matter. So
and then suddenly it was okay. Right. Suddenly it was okay. And so, yeah, like I think that's really what it is. It's not about fact checking. That's, I think, that's one of the most idiotic terms, because it has turned into something that is completely and totally ideological. And, if we're honest, I think most of the fact checking over the past several years has tended to be the people on the left who want to silence people on the right for saying things like, we got to know Robert Malone extremely well. I mean, all the fact checking on this guy. You had people that had never even taken a high school biology class in their life were like fact checking this guy who is, at least partially responsible for inventing this technology. I mean, it's just utterly hilarious. And people have no earthly idea what they're talking about. They only know, sort of what they're told. So to me, it's really more of a function of reason and really intellectual curiosity. And if you're just somebody who's just not willing to explore your own position and, look at information and make a reasonable decision about where you stand on something, it's hard for me, it's hard for me to think that person should elect somebody in Congress. And like, this is how you end up with people who don't understand that islands don't tip over in the middle of the ocean. This is how you end up with people that just keep electing somebody like Nancy Pelosi, who's just, she's a piranha. She's a parasite out there, trading on the system. One of the wealthiest people, in the history of politics. I mean, all these people that just continue to trade on this, and voters just don't see it and keep putting these people in power. Yeah, that's a problem with the system, but it's also a problem with the voters. And I think, for me, I think if I could snap my finger, I would at least want to tie demonstrated ability for judgment, reason, and intellectual curiosity. And that might not be popular, but I think that would probably go a long way.
You wouldn't tie it to like skin in the game. So you first of all have to pay taxes to vote, or have some sort of stake in the country where the outcome of it matters.
No, I think there's plenty of people who pay taxes and they don't demonstrate any ability to reason. And again, I think there's plenty of people that are incredibly wealthy who have no ability to reason whatsoever. I mean, let's think about all of some of the worst are the super ultra wealthy, hardcore radical left. I mean, a guy like George Soros is massively wealthy. So it's not about a class system, or you have to demonstrate any of this sort of stuff. I mean, that guy's paid a lot of taxes in his life, and plenty of people paid a lot of taxes. There's people that are on the left. Definitely, there's a lot of people on the left who have, definitely left positions, and I'll at least respect that they have those positions because they've thought through them and they have different experiences and so forth. And I go, okay, fine. Like, I don't need everybody to agree with me, and I'm not saying like it needs to be, the whole government should always be people on the right. I just think it should be a government that is chosen by people who actually have some clue of what's going on. And again, demonstrate the ability to reason and exercise good moral judgment. So, what you're talking about is, Robert Heinlein wrote that novel Starship Troopers. And Starship Troopers, it was this this concept goes back to the days of Rome. I mean, the Romans were very guarded about who they awarded citizenship to, because citizenship imbued in a certain portion of the population, at least, the right to vote. And they were very guarded about that. And in Starship Troopers, Robert Heinlein wrote about this sort of society where citizenship, like in the Roman days, wasn't just handed out to everybody, because ultimately it was the right to vote, and you had to earn it. And one of the ways, as in the book, was through service, through military service. But sure, these things like paying taxes or starting a business or something where you actually demonstrate skin in the game, that you have a vested interest, demonstrate that your incentives are aligned because you have this thing. Maybe it's a business, maybe you've served or whatever. So that means that you are, by that nature, thinking long term. You have to think long term as a result of that. And that was a science fiction novel, but I mean, I think there's a certain validity to that. And to me, that's I think the world and the United States would be a much, much better place. I think if you have a place like the United States, it's already a representative democracy. I think a republic is much better off if the people that you have voting are, have the ability to demonstrate reason, the ability to find truth, the ability to make a mature, long-term, responsible decision. And I think that would solve the problem. How you get there is obviously a more complex issue,
Right.
but I think that would be a start. Is that going to happen? No. I mean, that's
Well,
50 state laws need to change, potentially,
right.
Constitution. I mean, that's a long way up. But if I could just
So
snap my
speaking of the
finger.
Constitution, though, along these same lines, 1913 was a terrible year because it was the income tax, and then there was also the 17th Amendment, which stopped senators from being elected by state representatives and instead made it popular
Made it
vote. So
popular.
the U.S. senators being sent to Washington D.C. are now just another representative of the people, and now state governments do not have that representation in the federal government. So there's nobody representing the interests of the state governments in the federal government, and that I think was a huge mistake. And you could make the argument that the state legislatures that were voting for these senators, had a little bit more of that intellectual capacity to elect these people because they had already been elected at a local level by the people. So you're a little bit closer. You were talking about how on a daily basis, when you meet somebody, if they're completely full of it. At the local level, when you're meeting your politicians, you at least can see that they're a real person or interact with them a little bit, or they're your neighbor. So they might feel a little bit more accountability. But I don't know if you think that the representative of that nature, at least having states have some of that representation, is probably along the same
Are
lines.
we going to say the U.S. went off the rails in 1913?
I mean,
I would go back to
Federal Reserve was that year too.
I would go back to the Whiskey Rebellion. When Alexander Hamilton had to go and lead troops to put down a tax revolt.
So, like, 3 months after the Constitution was
the Whiskey
signed.
Rebellion was really interesting, because you had all these people who, I mean, they got swindled by a bunch of Wall Street traders. You had these guys that were going out and buying up all these IOUs from guys that bled for the revolution, guys that fought and bled in the Revolutionary War and were given IOUs, and they thought their IOUs were worthless. And so you had these financial speculators come down from New York and said, well, we'll buy all those up from you for pennies on the dollar. Then they went to their buddy in the Treasury Department and they said, hey, you got to make us whole on these. And so they passed a tax on whiskey, which was a really, really big deal at the time. A tax on whiskey in the early days of the United States would be the equivalent of passing a tax on cell phones today. Where you have people say, you're not, and just suddenly, and you have people that are going to come and seize your cell phone if you don't pay the tax. I mean, people today would go nuts over that. And that's what happened back then. And, they tarred and feathered one of the tax collectors, and there was a full-on revolt. And George Washington looked at Alexander Hamilton and said, this was your freaking idea. You go put it down. And, it was a brand new country. It was a brand new country, and they were already having to put down a tax revolt.
Well, it was even worse than that, though, because it was the tax was on individuals and the distributors. So if you were a distributor, you could pay this flat tax and undercut the prices of the individuals who were out there turning their wheat into alcohol so that they could make ends meet and transport it to market. And now they can't even compete with so it was like a protectionism right at the very beginning, where they were just trying to benefit these large distilleries, which could pay off the politicians. And then by the time they got out there to put down the rebellion, most of the guys that caused it had actually escaped already. So then they end up harassing and arresting all these innocent people. But I agree with you. The Whiskey Rebellion was not a
good chapter in the early days. Yeah. But you're right. When they first started, they said, we're going to have the Senate's going to be chosen by state legislatures, and their responsibility will be to represent the interests of their state. And that changed, and I think part of it was also that it was a hell of a lot easier to elect local people, because that pool of the political pool of constituents in the state was going to be a lot less, by district within the state. So it was a lot easier, made things a lot less complicated, but again, I don't foresee any of this stuff changing. So we just kind of hope our finger, what my concern is that since none of this is going to change, we can't all of a sudden expect constituents to just sort of wake up and go, oh, geez, we really need to put smart people in. I think quite the opposite. It just makes it, I think people are just going to get more polarized, and the sinusoidal nature of government is going to be very, you go from left to right to left to right. And the next person that comes in is going to completely undo what the last person did. And then, and you just go back and forth. It becomes very, very difficult. The rules of the game are constantly changing. And I think that, it's something that makes the United States look like a very unserious country, that foreign governments and central banks continue to go, I don't know about that place. They start pulling their money out, continue pulling their money out. Stop financing, treasury bonds and all the deficits every year. It makes the national debt harder to finance. I mean, there's a lot of consequences of that, of having really unstable, super polarized political system in the United States. There are a lot of long-term consequences from that. And my fear is that it's going to take a crisis before there's actually any meaningful change, any meaningful reform. And, as you and I have discussed, I think that's coming. And it's 8 years away. It's 2033. That's it.
Well, that's also why I thought a good candidate for what the underlying evil causing all these problems might be is the deficit or the debt in general, just not having balanced budgets.
Yeah, but the reason you have a deficit is because you have incompetent politicians who are thinking very short-sighted instead of thinking long-term. And the reason you have those people in power is because the voters keep putting them in power. Voters have yet to demand fiscal responsibility. I mean, honestly, the closest it came was in, 1992, when Ross Perot ran for president of the United States, specifically on the platform of reining in the deficit and reducing the debt and all this stuff. I mean, and bear in mind, the national debt was nothing compared to what it is today. I mean, interest rates were higher because you're in the late 80s, early 90s, so interest rates were a lot higher. And so the interest bill was a problem. They were looking at how much interest was going out the door with respect to tax revenue and so forth. And it was high, not as high as it is today, but it was high. But I mean, the national debt was so much less than what it is today. And, you had a guy who, he won 10, 15% or something like that of the popular vote. So, I mean, back then there were at least enough people who said, yeah, this is a big problem. And we need to do something about it. And that was really the last time they had somebody that was really campaigning specifically on that issue to say, we got to fix this. And I mean, the reality is, I think you're right that it's not the biggest problem that's bigger than virtually anything else is the debt. And more specifically, it's the ability to service the debt. You got a $36 trillion debt, and a $36 trillion debt is a problem. It's not really that big of a problem if your interest rate is 0.01%. Okay, yeah, big deal. It's peanuts. But, the problem is with the national debt is that, these treasury bonds mature every couple of years and they just get refinanced into whatever the current rate is today. So, every 4 or 5 years, basically the entire national debt, 5 years, 6 years, the entire national debt is getting refinanced at a higher rate of interest over time. And so what you see is the average interest rate on that U.S. national debt has gone from like sub 2% to now, it was like 1.3, 1.4% not that long ago. Now it's like it's pushing 4, and pretty soon it's going to be north of 5, if this trend continues. And so now you're looking at, again, your ability, the amount of tax revenue that it's going to take to pay interest is going to go through the roof. Today it's 23, 24, 25% of tax revenue. In 8 years, we talk about 2033, which is the year that Social Security's biggest trust fund is going to run out of money. By 2033, it could easily be 40% of tax revenue. That's a crisis. That's a crisis. You're spending 40% of tax revenue just to pay interest. You're spending 70% of tax revenue on Social Security and Medicare. You're already running a deficit, a huge deficit, just based on that. And then you got to pay for the military. Then you got to pay for all this other stuff. and it's just a problem that continues to compound on itself. And so that's going to be the thing. I mean, the United States would be able to withstand anything else. It could withstand war. It could withstand national emergency. It could withstand pandemic. It could withstand social issues and chaos and all these things. You cannot withstand a major financial crisis of that proportion. And this is a financial crisis. It is the most predictable financial crisis on the order of tens of trillions of dollars. And it's coming in 2033. There are very, very few things that could stop this. And at the moment, Congress and the White House, they're doing nothing to stop it. In fact, everything they're doing with the passage of this one big, beautiful bill really only encourages it and makes it even more certain that that's going to happen. It's not 100% certain, but boy, it's very likely. It's very, very likely that this is happening.
You were writing about Eisenhower a little bit yesterday, and you were telling me that one of the main things that he tried to prevent, or that he saw as a huge problem, was inflation. And this is why he would balance the budget to prevent the I guess, extra money that has to be spent when you take on debt, the deficit, to that would cause inflation, right? Because it's contributing
Eisenhower
more money to
he believed very clearly that deficits cause inflation. And that was the school of thought back then. He was not alone. Most people in politics presume that you've got to rein in spending. You got to run a balanced budget. That was the order of the day. And Eisenhower was very clear. He equated a balanced budget with national security. He thought inflation was a matter of national security, and he gave a lot of speeches, and he talked about this. And he basically said, if we don't have a sound currency, if we don't have a sound dollar, if we have inflation, then we won't have the ability to defend ourselves. We won't have a defense. Our ability to defend ourselves, support our allies, fight whatever war that might be necessary, protect the homeland, it all goes away if we have inflation. And so he was very, very clear. This guy was, this is a guy he was toe to toe with the Soviet Union in the early days of the Cold War. He had to oversee, the rise of the nuclear age on his watch. This is a guy that was in command of Allied forces to defeat the Nazis. He had that weight on his shoulders. It's like, if I don't defeat Hitler, then we're all going to be speaking German, and it's just going to be worldwide Holocaust. If I do defeat Hitler, then we have a free world. And those are the only two options. That's what was on this guy's shoulders. And in spite of all of that, this guy was terrified of inflation, to the point that there was a recession in his administration in 1957. And there are all these people in Congress said, we got to stimulate the economy. And so they created all these sort of Roosevelt era make work, public works projects, agriculture projects, all these different things. And all this stuff passed through Congress, passed the House, passed the Senate. And in August of 1957, Eisenhower vetoed multiple bills because he said, nope, not going to do it. We're not going to run a deficit. I don't care if there's a recession. We're not going to run a deficit. Because if we run a deficit, we're going to have a recession and inflation. And I'm not going to do it. And he turned out to be right, that this recession in 1957 was fairly short-lived. It lasted about 6 months. And the U.S. economy came out of it. It recovered very quickly, strong unemployment. And inflation the following year, after Eisenhower did not, after he vetoed these bills, did not engage in this massive spending, inflation was a big, fat, whopping 0.7%. So this is a guy, and throughout his entire administration, his average, on average, basically, he always ran a small surplus. It wasn't just like crazy surplus, because if you're running too much of a budget surplus, you're clearly, extracting way too much out of the economy. But Eisenhower felt like we need to basically break even. We need to have like a little bit of a budget surplus. And he did that. And they had very little inflation. They had robust economic growth. They had a solid labor market. This was a really good period of time for the U.S. economy. And this guy, people said it was probably the equivalent of like the Chuck Schumer, people will die if we don't pass these bills. And Eisenhower said, I don't care, veto. And he vetoed all these bills because they would have caused a deficit. And he was right. And you had at least one person in government that had the sense of maturity and responsibility to say, nope, I'm thinking long-term. This is bad for the country long-term. It's a national security issue, and I'm not going to do it. All right. So, it's just how times have changed, and you got everybody in Congress now that, all these guys want to do is run deficits and spend money. You got very, very, very few people that actually want to, actually seem to care and are willing to do something to run a balanced budget anymore. So, I mean, that was a long time ago, and how times have changed.
So I guess inflation, like we so often talk about, is the main thing that we have to take care of as individuals. Because
Mm-hmm.
I mean, have you lost hope at this point that the government's going to solve these problems by 2033? We've talked about this small window in the past of how limited this window was to turn things around, and kind of feels like the window has closed with the latest passing of the big beautiful bill. The main issue wasn't tackled. That puts us out another year.
The one big beautiful bill creates, it's basically creates a really significant deficit this year. It most likely adds to the deficit over the next 10 years. I think the tax cuts are nice. I always like tax cuts. I think tax cuts are really great for economic growth. They passed a tax cut in 1964. They got 8.5%, economic growth the year after, 1965. I mean, it was like the U.S. economy was a rocket ship in 1965. They ruined it by continued deficit spending. I mean, there's just a lot of similarities, honestly, with the 1960s, where you see the president of the United States was in a public feud with the Federal Reserve Chairman, throughout the rest of his administration. 65, 66, 67 was in a huge public feud and dispute, and you had massive deficits as they were funding the domestic priorities as well as a war abroad, and it resulted in a massive U.S. Budget deficit. That deficit caused significant inflation. Investors in the bond market started to pull away. Interest rates started to rise. You went from like sub 4% to over 7% on a 10-year Treasury note. And the other major similarity was that foreign investors started pulling away. Foreign governments and central banks started basically selling their dollars and buying gold. They didn't actually have to even buy gold. They just had to, back then the US dollar was redeemable for gold. So they didn't have to have the intermediate step of selling treasuries, taking dollars and buying gold. They just demanded redemption for their dollars. And so they're trading their dollars for gold, just as what's happening. All these things from what we see in the 60s are happening today. And what did we get? We got 10 years of stagflation in the 1970s as a result of that. And I think, frankly, that would be today kind of a lucky scenario, because the difference is in the 1960s, they were paying, 6-7% of tax revenue to pay interest on the debt. And again, today it's 25%. Debt to GDP was so much lower in the 1960s than it is today. And so, yeah, this is a huge problem. And instead of working to solve that problem, saying we have to fix Social Security. Social Security is going to run out of money in 8 years. We need to fix it now. And there was not a word about it in this beautiful bill. There was not a word about it. They did nothing to extend Social Security's solvency. Now, they did nothing to actually make meaningful reform to, the immigration code, to actually bring in talented, wealthy people, any of these things. There's no meaningful spending cuts. You got to have spending cuts at least to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. $300 billion is the magic number that gets you there. And, they're talking about, $7-8 billion, $10 billion here and there. It just doesn't get the job done. It doesn't get the job done. Right. So, yeah, they made it worse. They possibly even accelerate. I saw some analysis that because of all this stuff, that Social Security is now going to run out of money in 2032 instead of 2033. So we might have to rebrand Crisis 2033 is now Crisis 2032. I mean, it's like, it might just get closer and closer with each passing year. It's 1 year sooner, and we get 1 year sooner to that. It's like you lose 2 years with every year.
Yeah.
That's
Which
not a good
already
trend.
Happened, of course. It used to be 2040, then it was 2036, and it's just come down every year because
every year
finances get worse every year. But
that's right.
I found it interesting as well how the response was. So, of course, this all led to the foreign governments redeeming their dollars for gold, which back then, with a gold-backed currency, they could do in the 60s, they could do directly with the U.S. government. They said, okay, well, here's your dollar back. I'll take the gold that is backing it. And today, of course, it's not gold-backed, but we see them basically doing the same things where they're selling their U.S. securities and instead piling into gold as a safe haven asset.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of them, what they're doing is because government bonds mature, you buy a 2-year note, a 5-year note, a 10-year note. So what's happening is usually in the past, when their 2-year government, treasury note matures, they would just roll over and buy another one, right? And now they're not doing that. Now what's happening is when their notes mature, when their bonds mature, they say, you know what, I'm just going to take my money back. They don't reinvest again into another one. Or maybe they partially reinvest, but they take a good chunk of the proceeds out. And what do they do with that money? Sure, they might buy euros, they might buy some other things, some other government bonds around the world. But a lot of these central banks have been buying gold. We've been saying that for a long time. Central banks are taking dollars, they're moving out of dollars, and they're buying a lot of other things. And one of the big things that they've been buying is gold. And that has so significantly increased the demand for physical gold that the gold prices, basically, went to a record high and is still hovering very close to that record high. So, I mean, I think that the one big beautiful bill and the future trajectory of more and more deficit spending, the ideological divide, the inability for Congress. I mean, it's a sad thing when you see literally every single member of one party vote against something. I mean, it's the ideological divide is not, it's not doing the credibility of the U.S. government any favors at all. It doesn't make foreign governments and central banks more confident. And you need the confidence of foreign governments and central banks because they own such a massive chunk of the U.S. national debt. So you need these people to have confidence. You need the foreign governments and central banks to have confidence so that they do decide, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and buy more of those U.S. government bonds. I'm going to go buy more of those 5-year Treasury notes, or even 2-year Treasury notes, the shorter. So we say, well, we'll take some risk, but not too much duration risk. You need that confidence. And so all these things, I mean, people go and see every single Democrat voting against something, every single Republican voting in favor of it. It just doesn't do the credibility of the U.S. government any favors. And so this is why we think that trajectory is going to continue, that they're going to keep buying gold. They're going to keep diversifying out of the dollar, out of the United States and into something like gold, not because they're gold bugs or they have any kind of religious fanaticism over a hunk of metal, but because gold is and has been for a really, really long time, just a traditional asset, a strategic reserve asset that foreign governments and central banks hold. And there's a lot of reasons why that is. But again, you don't ever have to convince a central bank anywhere in the world. I mean, these aren't like sound money, anarcho-capitalist, libertarian. They're not at all. I mean, they're central bankers, right? So they're not coming out of the pages of Atlas Shrugged and walking out of Galt's Gulch into their central bank. These guys are just they just know that no central bank is ever going to say, what am I going to do with all this gold? They know it has value everywhere in the world. They know it's a reserve asset that's recognized by every other central bank, by the International Monetary Fund, by the World Bank. So it's a perfectly reasonable asset to hold regardless of their political or ideological leanings. And so we think that trend is going to continue. They're going to keep buying gold. And, I think we're in early innings with this. All right, we'll go and stop today. Thanks, everybody, for listening.